Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss democracy around the world, specifically more in just developed countries. Dissatisfaction with democracies in developed countries is at its highest level, I should say, in almost 25 years. That's according to a study of the University of Cambridge, which has been studying satisfaction rates with democracy since 1995. In 2019, the dissatisfaction was 58%, which was the highest recorded level. That's up from 48%, I believe, from the year earlier. What exactly is going on? The researchers have mentioned things like the financial crisis, as well as the fact that there is dissatisfaction in many other regards when it comes to government policies in those respective countries as well. Let's discuss all that a bit further. We're joined now by Einar Tangen, who is a political analyst, joining us now from Beijing. Joining us from the Gold Coast in Australia is Andreas Berg, who is also a political analyst. And joining us from Brisbane in Australia is Frank Moles, who is a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Queensland. Frank, Andreas, and Einar, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Andreas, let me start with you, if I may. What do you think is behind this level of dissatisfaction with democracy in countries which tout their democratic ideals?
I think the major problem is that the democratic institutions, as we have them in their current state, are no longer seen to be as democratic as they used to be. So the elites are getting a lot further away from the common man and vice versa. And so there's very little room for improvement, for maneuver, for betterment. I think that's the biggest problem. And so institutions seem to be self-serving, self-promoting in a way which is inconsistent with the original foundations of the democratic regimes.
Frank, what do you think is behind this? Because, as I mentioned, one of the reasons spoken of is possibly the economic shock of the financial crisis. Would that be enough to sort of, bring all this negativity in towards democratic institutions?
Yeah, I think the big assumption in the literature, for example, on populist parties, on far-right movements and so forth, typically assumes that those parties do well in times of economic crisis. And that's the logic behind that is the idea of this frustration that transforms into aggression, into a tendency to lash out to migrants, for example, and that fuels this kind of resentment politics. In our own work, we've looked at that very extensively and didn't actually find a strong link between that at all. In fact, what we found is a lot of examples of populist parties doing exceptionally well in times of economic prosperity, and also very popular amongst more wealthy sections of the population. So that is a bit of a myth, the idea that you need an economic crisis. So that's not the explanation at all, we think.
Einar, I wonder your thoughts are on that, because democracy has been sold to all of us around the world as this perfect way of governing, right? Is it democracy's fault, or is it just those respective countries' institutions? Is it capitalism? What exactly do you think is in the root cause of this unhappiness and dissatisfaction with those developed countries' democracies?
Look at it in economic terms. What you have is in the United States, prior to 2017, for 30 years, if you looked at 90% of the population, their actual income went down 0.8%. Then you have this kind of me first. Democracies work well when people are willing to put something towards the future, to delay gratification, to believe that there's something greater than the moment. But at this point in time, it seems that people vote selfish interests. We can look at Italy, we can look at Greece, and 98% all agreed that something had to change. But the same number thought that it was very important that nothing about their situation changed. And you're seeing a lot of that. I agree with my colleagues. This is about populism things. But, you shouldn't blame the system necessarily. You have to look at the people who are involved. What are their expectations? They're not being fulfilled. And I'd agree. The elites have gotten richer and more tone deaf to the needs, not just of the poor, but the middle class. And that's what democracies are based on.
Okay, so let's talk about the elites, Andreas, because that's been a topic of discussion for many years, hasn't it? That you have to be in a certain wealth category to even be able to think that you could be elected to any respective country's leadership. That's also problematic, is it not?
Very much so. I mean, if we look at in historical sense, we've grown up with the idea that one has leverage over the system which rules over you. And given the power of the elite, that leverage on the part of the common citizen is really not there anymore, not in the big scheme of things. One may elect certain governments, even impeach presidents, but really the structure remains much the same. And so when we talk about the elite, it's almost a case that they have their ends in view, which they pursue very well, and then there's everyone else with their little problems. And it's not clear how to actually navigate in this very murky environment. I think this idea of having global citizenship type education is potentially the way forward, but it's fraught with difficulties because it's not clear how you could actually have any common leverage over the system that rules over you.
Indeed. And Frank, that's been, I'm just using the U.S. as an example, a topic of discussion there too, right? Where every election is significantly more expensive than the previous one. Where, amounts of money are spent on just campaigns, which you imagine could go towards a lot of good in any such respective country. That's also problematic, is it not? Where a lot of interests, corporate or otherwise, get involved. And then that muddies the water, doesn't it, for democracy?
Absolutely. Of course, meritocracy is a big thing in the United States. The idea that anyone can make it from home pizza delivery boy to millionaire. And of course, in that mythology, that holds a long time until you discover that actually in order to be a US president, you do need a huge budget and a huge electoral fund behind you. So the prevailing idea, not just in the US, but across the Western world, is the system is rigged. That's the kind of message that people really have seized onto. And of course, that's something that populist leaders have really perpetuated. So I think that brings us to the question of, is this a genuine sentiment or is this a valid sentiment? And I think part of the answer is yes. And like Andreas already indicated, there are real problems in this world. We have excessive inequality that's now rising in most of these countries. We have scandals, right? Let's not forget Enron already some time ago. Let's not forget Volkswagen's software scandal. Let's not forget the Libor banking scandal. So to argue that populist voters are somehow misguided or uninformed and naive and stupid is really to miss the deeper point that there are serious problems in Western societies now manifesting in excessive inequality. And we've just recently published a paper in a prestigious journal that showed that in 27 countries where we looked at the levels of inequality using the Gini coefficient as an example, that we can see a predictable, stronger quest for a strong leader. So the call for a strong leader is clearly more pronounced in countries where inequality is now really reaching excessive levels. Okay,
so then Einar then becomes, sure, we understand the context in which populist, quote-unquote, leaders and populist parties are gaining support. But then that still is a very dangerous trend, is it not, for the rest of the world, where you have people whose speech is genuinely quite hateful, racist, however we want to term it, coming then into power or gaining seats in respective parliaments around the world. That's not conducive, really, to this globalized world.
No, it isn't. It's actually a kind of Pyrrhic victory. I mean, you get power, but you have no means of continuing it. I mean, the policies of most of these, quote, strong men have not resulted in any kind of economic opportunity. I mean, giving away money through a tax giveaway, as Donald Trump did, is a temporary sugar high. It did finally bring middle-class incomes up a smidgen. But the lion's share of everything went to stock buybacks and to line the pockets of the very, very wealthy. So you continue this trend of inequality, and it ironically gets the voters to go for somebody who says, "Yeah, I'm against the system." They don't necessarily examine what their policies are, whether they make sense, whether they work in a world where the global supply chain is the only thing that has been helping to draw down costs. at a time when income has remained stagnant. So, as I said, people are probably going towards the burning tree as opposed to away from it when they start going towards these populist leaders. I understand my colleagues saying that these people aren't naive when they vote for populists. I would disagree. I would say that they are, because they're not getting somebody who's going to solve the problems.
That's interesting. And I wonder where your thoughts are on that, because I don't know. I'm going to pick on, for example, the UK and the Brexit vote, right? And a lot of the sentiments that came up during that vote, or even where you are in Australia. And Scott Morrison has been criticized, as well as previous leaders in Australia, also about many of their points of view when it comes to immigration. Otherwise, very hard line, right? So, what does that then do to the I don't know if this is the right word or not, humane nature / moral nature of a lot of these democracies? That seems to be sort of, at the back of the mind. It's not really that important anymore.
It seems to be of much lesser importance. I think you're right there. In terms of Brexit, it's a situation whereby ideology has taken over politics. So your everyday Britons have, as it were, enlarged on their everyday local problems, and we're given a quick solution. The solution is called Brexit. Vote for that and all of your problems will be solved. And unfortunately they did, and the result is they have even more problems right now. In terms of Australia, I guess perhaps the gentlest way of putting it would be to suggest that the problem we have here is that we have one part of our political elite which is very forward-thinking and very well-educated and very global in terms of their sensitivities, and another part which is the exact opposite of that. And so far it's the latter which still pushes the agenda, especially in terms of immigration. The paradox is Australia needs immigration. It wouldn't survive without it, yet the very people that it needs are demonized in order to curry the favor with the most unworthy of citizens, as it were. That's one way of putting it.
Okay, so Frank, I'll give you the final word, not just in the context of Australia, but I think Australia is also an interesting example to pick on for a moment, because Scott Morrison basically is also denying the fact that climate change played a role in, the bushfires, which, mind you, still continue in Australia, for example. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily something that hurts democracy, but it is a democratically elected leader. I mean, the quality of these democratically elected leaders should also be up for discussion, right?
Yes, I think that's leadership is ultimately where this stands and falls, right? I mean, what we're now seeing in the Western world is actually a quite typical pattern. That's in most Western countries, we see some kind of significant populist movement that typically starts with 10 to 17% in the polls. And what then typically happens is that there's a shuffling to the far right by the mainstream right parties. And that's the story in Australia, that's the story in Britain, that's the story in the US. So it's a question about leadership, but also the mainstream parties on the right that have given in the hope to do damage control to keep the voters on board. But ultimately, what you do is actually the normative change that you actually facilitate is actually irreversible, or at least not reversible very quickly. I think that's also the story here in Australia, that conservative governments here, the Liberal Party particularly, has adopted a lot of the rhetoric, anti-immigration and sort of climate change denialism. And at the moment, that's in flux, I would argue, through the bushfires. But of course, there's a bit of a risk of wishful thinking on the part of people who believe that climate change is a real thing, in the sense that now finally we have evidence it's happening. And of course, it's from a social psychological, political psychology perspective, it's not that simple. Once people are wedded to a particular belief or view, they're hard to move away from that.
Very well. We'll leave there as a fact, but we appreciate all three of you for your time and insight. That was Frank and Andreas, both speaking to us from Australia, and Einar speaking to us there from Beijing. We appreciate their insights, certainly. This issue of democracy and the quality of it, especially in developed countries, is one of concern, isn't it? Because populist leaders are rising, filling the vacuum where democratically elected leaders who used to be of a certain quality, seemingly at least, that's what's been sold to us from history, are now filling those vacuums. These populist leaders are very hateful, racist, etc. Do they really represent the people that are electing them? Are the people electing them with all the information that they need? And what have then corporate interests? What have all those other parties which muddy the waters when it comes to democracies and the quality of democracies around the world? Of course, there is no such thing as an absolute democracy anywhere in the world, seemingly. And there's no place really where you can be poor completely and be elected, except in some very, very, very rare cases in the past. We'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's program, we're going to discuss Brexit on the 31st of January, i.e. tomorrow. The UK will officially be leaving the EU. What exactly should Britons as well as Europeans expect then to happen? Not a lot will change according to most estimates, but of course it will become official that Article 50 cannot then be taken back at that time, that Britain will already have officially left the EU, though it will then be in part of a transition period for at least 11 months. Now, Boris Johnson has said within those 11 months he's going to achieve a lot, pull off a lot of miracles, as many would say, especially when it comes to signing trade deals with the EU, as well as the US and others. Can he really pull it off? Will Britain come out of all of this unscathed, as we'd like to say? Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Klaus Jurgens, who is a political analyst and journalist. He's currently working from London. Previously, he's been in Turkey and Austria as well. He's a postgraduate from the London School of Economics and a master's in government. He's joining us now from London. Also joining us from the British capital is Jason Reed, who is a political analyst, freelance commentator, and deputy editor of the opinion website 1828. Jason and Klaus, thank you both for your time today. Klaus, we go to you with that. What do you think will be happening tomorrow? Do you think that there'll be any significant changes, especially during this transition period?
Thanks for having me. Well, I think what my esteemed colleague just wanted to elaborate on, technically speaking, yes, the United Kingdom is leaving by 11 o'clock local time, midnight Brussels time. And as you said, the Article 50 could not be revoked afterwards. Now, I sometimes say it is much more a psychological event than perhaps just the mere legal event. Up and down the country, there was this huge level of polarization over 3 years of bickering between yes and no, leave, remain, and all other topics were basically sidelined as if only Brexit would exist. Now, one of my biggest wishes is tomorrow, yes, let those who want to celebrate in style. And why not? Why not use the new 50 pence coin? Why not? And have a few days off and celebrate, and then let's start the actual work, because nothing really much is going to change with regards to what kind of relations do we have between the EU and the UK? What about the EU citizens in the UK and the British nationals in the EU? The transition period, this is the actual test of whether those who wanted Brexit are able to manage to achieve it. The ball is now much more in London's court than in Brussels' court. But yes, technically speaking, there will be some celebrations, not a big firework, which was cancelled.
Yeah.
True. Let's wait and see. The transition period, this is the crunch time for Brexit.
Jason, what do you think the UK should be doing after that transition period officially kicks in? Should there be celebrations? Should there be those coins in circulation? Because a lot of people are very, uneasy with all of the above, especially, I would imagine, in a context where there have been so many negative forecasts about what is now to come for the country.
Well, that's true. There is a huge amount of negative sentiment, and crucially, the country has been divided for years on this issue, and so there are a lot of people who are not happy at all that we're going to be leaving the EU tomorrow evening. But at the same time, last month there was a huge majority return to Parliament on a platform of getting Brexit done. People are fed up of this issue and they want to move on. And I think it's no great surprise that we're seeing that people were calling for Big Ben to be bonging on Brexit night as a celebratory thing. People are using the new 50p coins. And once we've entered that transition period, it will signal the start of a new era for British politics, because we'll be able to move on from this issue. We'll be able to refocus on domestic priority. We'll be able to start taking advantage of the opportunities Brexit presents, such as doing free trade deals with other countries around the world at the same time as we're negotiating our future relationship with Europe.
All right, so Klaus, then hanging in the wings of all of this is right now the U.S., which there's been talk of course, even during the campaign for the elections in the U.K., there was talk of possibly privatizing the NHS, all of the above. You've heard of all that, I'm sure. Do you think that's really on the table for a trade deal with the U.S.? Would Johnson do the unthinkable when it comes to the NHS?
No, I don't think so. We should not quote Chatham House meetings, of course, but as a matter of fact, a few weeks ago I was in London where this was discussed amongst some insiders, and the question was, as you said, would he really do it? I think the NHS is so dear to everyone. It is so much loved and so much loathed at the same time. I think this would rather be seen as a sell-off of Britain instead of a mere sell-off of the NHS. I don't see it coming, to be honest. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't see it coming. What worries me, however, in a expected trade deal, and now we have to talk about the pharmaceutical sector, could it happen that drugs which are used by the NHS would be more expensive as the result of a trade deal between the US and the United Kingdom, which perhaps would be done in haste to show the European Union and other partners around the world, if we can do it with the US, please, you have to fall in line. So this is a slightly bigger worry for the time being. I don't think the NHS is actually on the negotiating table, and Boris Johnson and his team must be very clever to make certain that it is not America pulling them over the table with drugs prices which could become part of a first free trade deal between the US and the United Kingdom.
Okay, so let's add another voice to this conversation. We're also now joined by David Hearne, who is a researcher at the Center for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University. He's joining us now from Birmingham. David, thank you for your time. David, I imagine that your research very much will still continue for at least the next 11 months, certainly, and even after, about how exactly this transition period will play out. What do you think will actually be achieved within 11 months? Everyone's saying a trade deal with the EU especially is next to impossible. Can Johnson, though, pull it off? It seems he's already pulled off the impossible, hasn't he?
Well, I think that I wouldn't say that anything is impossible. I think that I'd be wary about using extremely strong language such as that. I certainly think it's hugely ambitious. It will be difficult. It will depend a lot on exactly what kind of trade deal he wants, what kind of trade deal the UK decides it wants, and what exactly it's willing to sacrifice to get there. That will be the interesting, and I think we perhaps won't have clarity on that until much later in the year. So certainly, I think it's hugely ambitious. It's an ambitious timescale, but I wouldn't rule it out as being completely impossible.
Do you think, though, David, do you get that Johnson would be willing to sacrifice a lot more than would be good for the country?
Well, once again, I think that the issue here is there are trade-offs. There's always trade-offs. There are going to be trade-offs. Any free trade agreement involves trade-offs. That's the nature of the beast. The question isn't so much as what would be good or bad for the country necessarily, as what would be good or bad for certain groups of people. And bear in mind that Johnson in particular is beholden to certain groups of voters who perhaps wouldn't have voted for the Conservative Party, his party, in the past.
Okay, so Jason, what are your thoughts about getting this sort of a trade deal done, be it with the EU or the US? Pompeo is currently in the UK. Do you think that this sort of situation right now, where the UK seemingly on the outset at least is in a weak position where it needs to get all of the above done before December 31st, at least in Johnson's words, I would imagine there's some level of desperation there on the part of Johnson?
I think that Boris Johnson is being obviously extremely ambitious, but we've heard this kind of thing before. We heard that he would rather die in a ditch than fail to take us out of the EU on the 31st of October, and then he ended up calling an election instead. I think Johnson realizes that sometimes you do have to go back on your promises in order to make things become a reality. And I think there's a decent chance that we might reach the end of this year, and he is in a similar situation where he faces the choice between either taking us over a cliff edge and leaving the EU without a trade arrangement, or just extending the transition period for a few months to make sure that happens. When it comes to trade deals with other countries such as America, there isn't that same time pressure And so I don't think that, and there isn't the same hostility in the relationship either. Obviously, we've just left the EU, so it's going to be a difficult negotiation, whereas things will be, it will feel like much more of a new opportunity with other countries around the world.
Klaus, I'll give you the final word. That question of hostility with the EU. This hasn't been a very pretty campaign or couple of years when it comes to relations with the European Union, has it? So, especially with Nigel Farage and what he pulled recently in the European Parliament on his way out, there's a lot of, I would imagine, bad blood between the two sides. Do you think the EU will also be looking to make life as hard as possible for Prime Minister Johnson?
Well, I think I'll try to be as brief as possible. Yesterday, the German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, published an open letter to Boris Johnson and the British people, where he basically said, we feel sorry. Is it hello or goodbye? We rather say it's goodbye. A goodbye and then a hello again. And he detailed that he thinks it would be wrong if Brussels now shows the cold or the hard shoulder to the United Kingdom, alienating them further. It was basically a building of bridges statement on the condition that after the transition period there will be a fair trade agreement between the two sides, that Britain sticks to its promise to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And very, very interesting that the question of free movement, not only for those who are currently living in any of the two entities, but for all new arrivals must be guaranteed at some stage too. What about students, academicians, workers, cross-border workers, consultants, anything, you name it, tourists, retired people who now want to move to the UK or now want to move into the EU after the transition period? Would they receive a kind of settled, guaranteed status as well? Or would an Australian type of kind of points-based system be implemented? This is what worries the EU citizens very much, and I think Heiko Maas too. But he says, do not let's burn the bridges, reach out, let this weekend happily and quietly and peacefully pass. Then it's time to sit down together, roll up our sleeves. But definitely Germany doesn't want to lose Britain as a partner. I think the EU doesn't want to lose it. Now this Tohu Wabohu, the rabble settling, all is over. But I don't think that the EU is intent on alienating London or playing a kind of game with Boris Johnson. Haha, now you've got it, but we don't like it. I don't think so. I think diplomacy will win.
Very well. We'll leave it there. The final word. That was Klaus speaking to us from London. Also speaking to us from London was Jason, and we were also joined from Birmingham by David. We appreciate their insight, of course. When it comes to this issue of Brexit and the UK leaving the EU tomorrow, January 31st, it's just essentially symbolic at this point in time because this just kicks in the transition period, which will last 11 months. Will a trade deal with the EU, most importantly, be developed and finalized within these 11 months? Again, ambitious, as our guests there said as well. Many people say impossible also, but it's also just about the sentiments, about how all of this really came about and how all of this has played out as well. Does this make the UK less investor-friendly, for example, or does this make it more investor-friendly now that it can make its own regulations and policies also? We'll have to wait and see, of course, how this all plays out for Britons in the coming days and years, really, as well. I'll be back with the next segment after this, please. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Mike Pompeo's U.S. Secretary of State's visit to the UK. This all is coming on the heels of a number of disagreements between the two countries. We're going to talk about Huawei, of course, but also the Iran nuclear deal, as well as other such smaller disagreements as well on issues such as that young child who was killed, the teenager who was killed, by a woman who claims that she has diplomatic immunity. She's the wife of a diplomat. She's now in the U.S. The U.S. is saying that they're not going to extradite her back to the UK to stand trial. But the more important ones, as I said already, about 5G and the network that Huawei would have control over within the UK, that seems to be a huge concern for the Americans, as well as, of course, the stance that the UK has taken when it comes to trying to preserve the Iran nuclear deal, at least as a stance that is taken on the outside. Will all of these differences be worked over, especially at a time when the UK desperately needs a trade deal also with the US within now this time, as Brexit is to kick in from tomorrow itself. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Leo Barnes, who is a senior editor at Foreign Policy Press. He's joining us now from London. Also joining us from the British capital is Mark Brolin, who is a political analyst, economist, and author of A State of Independence, Why the EU is the Problem, Not the Solution. And also from the British capital is Robbie Travers. He's with the Gatestone Institute. He's a government advisor and political consultant. Robbie, Mark, and Leo, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Mark, let me start with you. What do you make of Pompeo's visit? Will he be able to get his way and get assurances, for example, when it comes to the 5G network?
Well, I think in a sense there is less hair than meets the eye. I think Boris Johnson has been stuck between a rock and a hard place, and he has pulled off a classic balancing act, and that's actually the only thing he could do. So he has limited the Huawei commitment, which has meant that both the Chinese and the Americans can save face. What this commitment means going forward, that's a bit subjective. So the Americans have to keep up the pressure points. They have to say you have to really stick to these limits. And I think that's today's meeting is about exactly that.
Leo, what are your thoughts on that? Because now we need to come to a trade deal as well. And as we know, Donald Trump does not like to negotiate as anyone else would. He's very much into the optics of it all. For the UK to have still allowed Huawei even a little bit of access, I imagine, does anger him?
Yes, I'm sure it does anger him. However, I don't think he would have been particularly surprised. There were reports that came out over the last couple of weeks that in order to disassemble the already existing network that included parts from Huawei, it would have costed the UK in the hundreds of millions of pounds. So that's something that he would have been conscious of, as would Pompeo. But I do think that this won't be too much of a sticking point over the coming weeks. The former Brexit Secretary David Davis said in an interview just last night he thinks Donald Trump is something of a transactional player in international relations. He might disagree with this, but the next week it'll be a different topic and his mind will be completely focused on that. So as much as he will be upset at this, I don't think it will preclude sound cooperation in the future, specifically with the upcoming trade deal.
Okay, so Robbie, what are your thoughts on that? Will Huawei be a point of disagreement, or do you think that they'll just learn to get on? But then if we're talking about the Iran nuclear deal, for example, that's a lot more sensitive topic, I imagine, for especially Donald Trump, who's been very, that's the one issue he's actually been very consistent on from day one as president, that he hates the Iran nuclear deal. He wants everyone to walk away from it. Britain at this point isn't at that point.
I would actually agree with the David Davis assessment, but I would also add that this has actually come at a wonderful time in terms of Boris Johnson making this decision. He couldn't have been more fortunate. Trump is obviously suffering massive domestic problems. His attention will be on this massive growing risk with John Bolton, with having to defend himself in the Senate, having to have Rudy Giuliani coordinated with Alan Dershowitz. All of this is a perfect storm at the moment that will probably mean Trump will not be paying quite as much attention to the current decision. But on the Iran nuclear deal, I think actually there is not necessarily less agreement. I think the UK poses less of a challenge to Trump than Angela Merkel and Macron do, because they're more supportive of the deal. Boris Johnson has said in various interviews that he wishes to, if there is a new deal to be had, let us make that deal. Boris Johnson is far more ambivalent about the Iran nuclear deal in its current form than the other leaders. So I actually don't think the Iran nuclear deal is the massive sticking point in the relationship. And I also think, I agree, I think Huawei will gradually dissipate as an issue, more because Trump is so focused on domestic issues right now. And I think Pompeo will also, be suffering from that too.
Okay, so Mark, how do you assess the current relationship between the UK and the US at this point in time? Do you think that the UK is almost in a desperate situation to try to get this trade deal done, and that it will bend over backwards, possibly, and sacrifice a tad bit too much so that it can get this trade deal with the US done?
I think in a sense, yes, but I think the same goes in Washington. I think both sides will bend over backwards. There is so much benefit both for Trump and Boris Johnson if they do get some sort of skeleton trade agreement before the election, the US presidential election. So I think there is lots of willingness on both sides to accomplish something which at least looks like the beginning of a trade deal. So I think that will make a major difference to the previous years that have just passed, when we have the Brussels actually wanted to sort of halt or had incentives to stop an agreement. And now we have a totally different situation between America and the UK. So I think there are good prospects to actually have a trade deal. The trade deal will trump every other issue. There will be more issues coming up over the following months. But I think the importance of that trade deal to both sides will mean that it will trump everything else.
Leo, when about bending over backwards, specifically from the UK side, that during the election campaign there was talk of possibly the NHS being privatized. All of that is, of course, at this point in time, the government has said that would never happen. But nevertheless, there are other ways to hurt the healthcare within the UK, isn't it? I mean, there is talk of possibly privatizing or talking about pharmaceutical companies, making drug prices a lot higher, et cetera, just adding on more costs for Americans to then make that much more money off the UK. Do you think that would be something that would be on the table?
I mean, it will certainly be on the table. There was an article written just the other day by the former president of the Board of Trade, Vince Cable, who helped negotiate parts of the trade deal that we currently that we used to operate under with the US, and he said that there's no way that the NHS and the various elements that you just mentioned cannot be on the table. And this was also points raised by Barry Gardner at Labour Front Bench the other day. However, there are a variety of different sticking points. It's the environment, public services, regulations. All of these things will form pretty big hurdles that they'll have to overcome. However, I think certainly in the coming months, Mr. Johnson and also Mr. Javid will be far more focused on the EU negotiations. They make up about 50% of our trade at the moment, whereas our exports to the US is only about 20% and imports 10%. So I think I agree with what Mark just said. It will have to be a skeleton agreement, but simultaneously, I think they will be putting far more energy into the EU agreement.
Okay, so Rob still wanted to talk about these two legal cases that are going on right now in both respective countries. One is, of course, about the U.S. diplomat, the wife of the U.S. diplomat, that is, who is claiming diplomatic immunity with the killing of this teenager in a road accident in the UK. And then on the other side, we have Prince Andrew and the entire case of Jeffrey Epstein. I know that that's a fairly small issue in the context of what we're discussing here, but do you think that those sorts of issues, which, again, the optics of do not look very good on either side, can they be resolved amicably for both sides?
I think that it's important to note that there's a kind of asymmetry here in the cases. Anna Satulis is a big story in the UK. The family of Harry Dunn are regularly on the news. This is a big, important thing. We have ministers visiting them, speaking with them, on television with them regularly. In the US, it's not a big story. And that's really, I think, why there's not been much in terms of a kind of a public backlash in the US or anything to do with that. And that's why there's really not been much progress there. So in terms of the dispute, it really is in terms of, in an international sense, a dispute between two governments. Because in the US, there's no real dispute on the ground. However, the Prince Andrew Jeffrey Epstein situation is quite different because there is a massive awareness of not only Prince Andrew, who's trended across the globe, and there was a massive, obviously, story about Epstein. So what I would say is that I think, though, there is a difference in the fact that the US government are very unwilling necessarily to touch the British royal family. They see it as a constitutional situation. However, as a columnist in The Spectator put it, Prince Andrew will not be taking a holiday to New York City or any other American place very soon. Yeah. And I think there really is. I think Prince Andrew can't not cooperate. His interview was disastrous. It was, widely regarded as one of the worst interviews of the last decade. How poisonous and toxic it was. So you will have to investigate. Will he be subpoenaed in the US? I doubt it. Will there be much of an appetite to do that from any branch of US government? I doubt that even more.
And Mark, I'll give you the final. What are your thoughts on these two cases and whether these two governments can come to some sort of an understanding for all parties to then be satisfied?
I think they will. I agree with Robbie here. I think they will be dealt with a bit differently. Prince Andrew is sort of an embarrassment to both sides. So I think that will be perhaps handled behind closed doors as far as possible. The other row regarding the diplomatic immunity, I think that's a different case. I think there will be smoke and dust kicked up for symbolic reasons, but I think in the end, both sides will hope that it will be forgotten. I think there has been so much out in the air openly now that it's hard to back away from the principles at stake. So I think not much will be accomplished, but they will have to pretend doing something. So that's I think on both these issues, they will just go away after a while.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but appreciate all three of you for your time. That was Leo, Mark, and Robbie, all speaking to us from the British capital today, sharing their vital insight with us. There are a lot of issues on the table when it comes to relations between the UK and the US, UK and China, pardon me. The Chinese Huawei, of course, factor is huge at this point in time. And of course, that affects the relations right now between the United Kingdom, especially at a time when it's in a Brexit transition phase now, officially from tomorrow itself, as well as the Trump administration, which is going through its own political domestic issues, as our guests also mentioned. That will play a huge part in this relation because Trump needs all the foreign allies that he can have to create more distractions and to create more positive news for himself, especially with an election coming up at the end of this year in November. So will this trade deal, for example, between the UK and the US go forward, even in a skeleton form, as Mark there mentioned, as well as Leo? Or will that not happen because of the sensitive issues possibly on the table? Would the Americans want to touch the NHS or pharmaceuticals and increase drug prices, for example? Then what of the Iran nuclear deal? Is that as big an issue as we may think it is, considering Johnson has said a number of times he may very well support another deal, the Trump deal, as he's called for it? And then those two legal cases, which I mentioned at the end, can they really be resolved amicably? Because they are both fairly severe cases, and they both do require some form of justice, I would imagine, to satisfy all parties involved. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.